All right, it's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Agile Friday. I'm Justin Burns from the Office of the CIO. I'll be your host. Joining us today is Greg Smith from GS Solutions. Greg will be talking to us about 7 reasons why sprints fail and what you can do about it. This will be a 1-hour event with 30 minutes presentation from Greg, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Using the chat window, you can send questions at any time, and we'll forward them on to Greg after the presentation. Please submit your questions privately to me, Justin Burns. Agile Fridays are a collaboration between the Office of the CIO and Results Washington. You can find out more and keep up to date at ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays. A big thanks to Greg and GS Solutions for helping us out today. With that said, I'll turn the control over to Greg Smith. Greg, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you so much, Justin. Is the audio okay on your side?
Sounds good to me.
Great, then I'll continue. Hi, everyone. Nice to speak with you today. I'm up in Bellevue, Issaquah, watching it debate whether it's going to squall, so I'm guessing it's probably about to do the same in Olympia. Maybe you guys have a clearing. But real quick about me, I've been doing Agile since 2000, 2001. And for those folks who might remember a book called Rapid Development by Steve McConnell, if that counts, maybe I can go back to like 1995 or so. That was really where I started looking at better ways to deliver software projects. So I got trained by Jim Highsmith at an internet startup down in Seattle, down on King Street, and learned Agile. And then once my .com startup disappeared, the one thing I did get was maybe my stock options didn't make it, but Agile was actually worth something, and I started using that everywhere I went, and kind of leveraged my knowledge there and started helping other companies create custom Agile frameworks. And I eventually went into business for myself, helping some of the folks you see on the screen here. So I've done work with folks like Fannie Mae, still engaged right now with the City of New York and helping them use Agile with their vendors, and also with internal applications and with mobile applications. And I've been really impressed with their ability as a government agency to get around bureaucracy and be effective. That's been great. And then I do a lot of work too with companies you might know, Microsoft and Chase, and one of my favorite clients, StubHub down in the Bay, and in Seattle, Expeditors International. I also do a lot of work with PMI. As a matter of fact, PMI uses a book I co-wrote back in 2009 as a part of the curriculum for the PMI Agile certification program. So I'm very happy they did that, and I love working with PMI, do a lot of work with chapters. And as it says here at the bottom too, yes, I'm an Agile person, but I would tell you that when I do an engagement with a client, there's usually issues in all 3 of these areas: Agile, Lean, and just the basics of project management. And I help folks in all those areas so we can be effective. I don't just focus on Agile. I look where the biggest need is. And kind of related to that, if you want to meet me in person, I got invited to participate in a sort of a game show format on the 21st of May down in Olympia, actually in Lacey, close to Olympia there. And we're going to do like 1-hour debates about what's better, Agile, Lean, or traditional with the folks you see there listed on the screen. So I'm doing more and more work in the Olympia area, and I'm looking forward to it. It actually helps get me off the road from going to places like Houston and New York City, which I appreciate. So I'm guessing the majority of folks on this webinar today are Agile practitioners, and you don't need me to tell you what sprints are. But I'm sure everybody on the call has seen that different Agile coaches say different Agile things, and we're not necessarily all synchronized. So I did put one slide in here to just kind of baseline us on what I call a sprint. And to me, a sprint's hopefully what everybody else has heard. We try to deliver some subset of production-ready software at the end of typically 1 to 4 weeks. But as I noted here in the purple, I have some clients using 8-week sprints. And production-ready doesn't mean it goes into production. It just means it's in a state where we can't see anything missing that would stop it once we get the rest of the code that needs to go with it complete. And some folks, too, look at sprints and say, well, sprints and Agile are just for people doing custom code. And once again, I'd say probably 50% of the folks I work with are using off-the-shelf products, and they're configuring those and maybe doing a little customization. But you can deliver off-the-shelf software and configuration in a sprint or iterative manner also. And sprints have dedicated teams, and sprints have a dedicated person to elicit the requirements from and to prioritize the requirements and drive the team and tell them what we need for our customers. And I noted here too, I won't be covering this today, but sprint is a real solid process for just iterative delivery of almost anything where things just kind of queue up. So I see it used for like help desks and other processes too. It doesn't just have to be used for software projects. So that's my quick baselining of what sprints are. If anybody's on the call saying, what about iterations? To me, iterations and sprints are the same. Iteration is a term from the extreme programming Agile family, sprints the term from the Scrum family. And if I had my druthers, as I like to say, I would use the term iteration because sprint implies we're running as hard as we can. And I don't think we run as hard as we can throughout a project. So I think we iteratively deliver at a fast pace, but we don't sprint throughout a project. But it's the most common term today, and I have no issue with that. So most people know sprint. Then why sprints? We probably have the same baseline here too, but I just wanted to put this in. It allows us to get value to the customer early and frequently, and we deliver the highest value items to the customer first. And I'm sure everybody on the call knows we have discoveries in a project, and sprints say, don't interrupt me while I'm coding, but when I come out of like a coding session in a sprint, you can tell me about discoveries and then we can replan the project and not pretend that there's never a discovery. And then the other thing that's great about sprints, if they're done correctly, is they're very transparent, and we don't have to go look at a Microsoft project plan and say, well, 70% of the tasks are complete, and then wonder what our true status is. Sprints promote the most important metric, which is how much code is truly complete. It gives us true project transparency, which is what I love. So there's a couple of baseline slides before I jump into 7 ways to improve sprints, or 7 issues that people usually come across. And folks probably have questions piling up, and you probably just heard Justin say, we'll take a break here at 11:30, and then we'll stop for questions. Okay, so my definition of a sprint failure, and not to digress here, but as I was sitting here waiting to come on, I noticed that this train car actually is number 13. I wonder if that's a coincidence or not. But for me, a sprint failure is you make a commitment to your customer with certain functionality by a certain date. So if you miss that date and don't give them that functionality they wanted, that would be a sprint failure. Inconsistency in understanding. So if different team members, like if dev and QA and business analysts, all have a different understanding of what's supposed to be done in the sprint, that's a sprint failure. And of course, if you deliver something the customer does not want at the end of the sprint, that's also a bad thing. And this kind of goes to what I said a second ago, where I like the term iteration better than a sprint. If you took somebody like Usain Bolt and had him sprint, 100 meters, he'd win the race, and you'd say, that's awesome. If you asked him to run at that same pace for 10,000 meters, like a 6K or 10K race, he would probably pass out after about 400 meters. So we really want to do work in a way that scales, so a nice, effective pace, but we don't want to burn out the team. And if you do that in a sprint, that's a failure. And things like working as departments is also a failure, where you say, well, the dev team delivered their stuff, but QA failed. Or QA says, well, we tested everything, but dev didn't get us everything. In a sprint, we want the whole team to say, if we succeeded or failed, we do it as a group, not as a department. Customers don't really care about our departments. They just care about whether they get their software. And of course, too, kind of a crossover into lean. If you have a lot of excessive waste or delays in your sprint, that's not good either. That may not be a failure, but over time it can become a failure if it actually stops you from hitting your dates. And last thing I'll mention here is a lack of discipline. A lot of people don't say this enough. There's even a new, flavor or marketing term around Agile called Discipline Agile Delivery, which a lot of you may have heard of. And I think that's good that these folks have started that, but I would tell anybody that there's been some misunderstanding if we ever thought Agile wasn't about discipline from day one. It's never been about being sloppy or not having craftsmanship. So we want to be really good and deliver scalable, extensible code when we deliver a sprint, and that's where discipline comes in. So if we think about sprint failures, as an Agile coach, I can categorize what's happening in numerous buckets. But the two big buckets I put out there are education failure and situation failure. So related to education, I can definitely speak to this as an Agile coach. There's a lot of lack of knowledge out there or inconsistent understanding of Agile. And a lot of people are rolling out Agile based on a class that one person took or their experience someplace else. And they're missing what I like to say, and this is where I come in to help folks, is these little things of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, like just little bitty things in sprints, actually kind of hinge which way the teeter-totter kind of goes, whether you're successful or not. And they're really subtle things typically, and I hope to show you some of these subtle things in the next few minutes. But definitely I see sprint failures or poor sprint delivery often tied to education. And then the other thing that I see is somebody may have a perfect education, but when most of us go to a certified Scrum Master class or our user story workshop, a lot of times these workshops are perfect world. And we don't take into account that perfect world's not waiting for us when we get back to our desks. And that's what I see a lot of, is people have constraints that we don't talk about during training. So probably a lot of you maybe have folks coding or testing for you in India or China. Sprints want dedicated team members, and maybe your team members are being plucked away from you to go work on other projects that are considered higher priority or for production support. Sprints want the customer to be available when the team has questions on a requirement. And I see a lot of companies I work with have what I call cameo customers who show up a little bit in the sprint, but they're not really available or engaged. And of course, a lot of you probably are doing government-related work, so there's governance and there's regulations that often will impede using perfect world Agile and doing sprints the way you're trained. And of course, maybe you have a volatile business environment. You're in the middle of a sprint and the world changes nonstop. Your competitors are doing something, or you have high turnover. Who knows? And then lastly, sprints and Agile in general are kind of aimed at mature teams. They're really a set of mature practices. And if you have a green team or a lot of turnover in your teams, that's a situation that will affect your ability to deliver. Because once you figure out how to deliver sprints, you might start losing that tribal knowledge over time. So those are the two big categories for me, education and situation. And so I'll talk about 7 issues now that kind of tie back to these two categories. Oh, and just a real quick point too, which I'll point out today. When you do have these impediments, there's usually a way to either minimize them so they don't totally prevent sprint delivery, or to subvert them totally, to avoid them altogether. And I'll be discussing some of those in the next few slides. Okay, so I shouldn't say story number 1, but issue number 1, no sprint structure. And I think this ties a little bit to education. But I meet a lot of teams, and this is their sprint flow chart, if you will. We talk to the customer, they give us a bunch of stories they consider high value, they go into the sprint that we're doing, and then magic comes out the other end, we've got production-ready code. And it literally looks like this. They'll actually say, okay, this is day 1, give us the stories, we're going to suck them in, something magical is going to happen, and on the last day of that sprint, you will have production-ready code. And most places I go, that 3-week sprint, 2-week sprint, whatever it is, it's chaos in there because there really isn't any structure around the activities. So this is one example of a client I recently worked with who is doing 3-week sprints. And what you can see here is they've said the first 2 days of a sprint are usually where we get the desired stories from the customer. And at the end of day 2, we've looked at them and done a little more detailed analysis, and we broke the work down to the hour level, and we make the call on whether the work's going to fit or not at the end of day 2. So that's sort of their sprint planning window, and they formalize this. And they don't always follow this. If sprint planning goes fast, they'll take off on day 1. If for some reason it goes a little long, they might go into day 3. But they have a structure, and they know that they have a ballpark window of trying to be done with planning after the first 2 days. And then this team hops in on day 3, and they go through the next week and so on, and they're trying to deliver stories. and then they've got the last 2 days kind of reserved for reviewing and demoing and retrospectiving and preparing for the next sprint. So this may seem simple, but it's amazing how many teams I don't see sit down and do this. And some of the ones I do will grab a book that says, well, we do 2-week sprints, and here's the structure they did in their book, and they won't take into account the type of work they're doing or how long they really need to do effective sprint planning. So you need a structure like this, and you really need to make sure it fits the kind of work you're doing. So not saying it's always 3 weeks here, not saying it's always 2 days for sprint planning. Whatever it is for your company, though, establish sort of a template that the team can kind of envision and think about as they're going through the sprint. So looking at this structure diagram, if you will, it kind of ties to a second issue I see when people don't put a structure in place. I usually see something happen like this. So we come out of sprint planning, and the developers say, okay, we're going to code like the wind, and about halfway through the sprint, QA, we're going to pass you this stuff, and then you're going to pass us back and forth bugs, and then by the last 2 days of the sprint, hopefully everything's good, and we'll meet our dates. And really, this is what I call doing waterfall within a sprint. You can do this. I see a lot of teams do this by accident, not realizing that you're not supposed to do this. But if Agile and sprints at their core are about getting value to a customer, there's a chance you use this model and you'll get like 10 user stories, all 90% complete, but give zero value to the customer because none are usable. So a better model is to go like this. So you can see here I'm showing like in week 1, we come out of sprint planning and the developers take off and they're writing code. And while they're writing code, QA is probably writing test cases. And then as we get to week 2, they say, okay, story 1 is done. So QA, can you test it? And I'm going to start working on story 2. They take off in story 2. QA gets done with story 1 in week 2, passes it to the customer, asks for acceptance, and so on and so on. So a very good sprint, a healthy sprint, will focus on trying to get stories production ready as soon as possible in the sprint. Not just like the last day of the sprint, but throughout the sprint, we're trying to iteratively, totally complete stories. And I don't always see it go like this, like one story. I will see, we'll say, we're going to deliver you 2 or 3 stories at once because they make sense to test together. But we still want to follow this model. We don't want to take all the stories and code them completely and then pass the test. We want to get feedback early from QA while there's still time to triage and fix these stories. And by delivering to QA iteratively throughout the sprint, it addresses that issue. All right. My daughter was sitting beside me the other day when I was working on this deck, and I said, you know this thing, what you see is what you get, and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So she's like 15. All she knows, I think, is Snapchat. But I said, well, I'm going to try to invent an acronym for this webinar that I'm doing. I'm going to do a WYWIWWCT. And, of course, she looked over at me and said, that's lame, and went back to Snapchat, put her headphones on. But anyway, going back to this, I can't tell you, this may be sprint issue number 1, even Agile issue number 1. We have customers who say, you guys are doing 3-week sprints. This is what I want when the 3 weeks is over. And when they say what they want, they may have a business goal. They may have some kind of commercial they're getting ready to do, some kind of release, some kind of dependency with another department. There's no problem with that. I want customers to do this, to say this is what I want. But what so many teams do is they become intimidated and they say, well, that's what I got to deliver. And instead, and hopefully a lot of you are doing this, I want you to go through that sprint planning process we talked about. And you can take the what I want into sprint planning. But then when you come out of sprint planning, before you commit to the sprint, I want you to break your work down something like this. So, you know, how much .NET work do we think this will require? How much testing? How much Ajax? I want you to look at how much time you think you'll need during the sprint. And then I want you to look, like by department or person, how many hours they truly have available and see whether it fits or not. So like in this example, once we looked at what the customer wanted, it looked pretty good from a user experience, tester, and Ajax perspective, but the .NET developer was probably going to come up short. And I'd want .NET team or .NET developer to tell the customer that, and let's adjust the scope so we can really feel good about committing to it. So nothing wrong with the client asking you or the customer, product owner asking you for something for a sprint, but the team should do some level of analysis and estimate, make sure it fits first. We really want the customer to get confident that when we say we can deliver something, we will deliver it. And if we keep taking what they ask for and never sizing it, more than likely we're going to have a lot of misses, and it's going to hurt the relationship and lower their confidence in us. All right, maybe this is issue number 2 with people I talk to who are doing sprints. They know Agile or sprints are Scrum are supposed to have dedicated team members, but something always happens. Well, there's a production issue, and Jim's the only person who knows that code, so we had to let him go work on the production issue. Or this other hot project came up, or management thinks they can allocate this person across multiple projects, even though we could totally dedicate them. They've allocated them across 3 or 4 different projects. So this is a very, very common issue. So if you're a Scrum Master or a project manager on this call, you're probably doing CYA already, where you say, we sized up this sprint, we committed to it with these people, and then you show at the end of the sprint what happens to kind of cover your butts and make sure nobody blames you. But what I'd rather see is if you have a sprint team of 10 people, and you see on average you lose about, I don't know, 20% of those people or something, 10% of those people, pull 1 or 2 people out of the sprint. Say you don't get to play, we're going to pretend you're not even here, you're on production support. And maybe we'll use you to help if there's really no production support going on, but from an allocation and estimation perspective, we're going to pretend you're not here. And when I go to companies that really have a very consistent pattern of production support need, I encourage them, create a support team. Like sure you can escalate to the dev team when you can't figure it out, but if there's really that much demand, dedicate people. You'll see better efficiency and throughput on troubleshooting production issues, and you'll actually see more back office projects get delivered if you dedicate teams. And then lastly, if you can't do these first 2 bullets, just back out that capacity. Even if you can't allocate people, back out. We're going to lose 30, 40% of the developer's time to production support when you actually do your estimation of work versus capacity. And then there was one team I worked with just recently in San Francisco, and I walked her through, the project manager / Scrum Master, I walked her through all these things. And even we coached management that the impact they were doing by pulling folks, and we really couldn't make a change. We made a very compelling analytical argument, but I'm sure folks know sometimes management just does what they want to. So on her own, she made the call. My sprints are being interrupted so much, sprints are stupid. I'm going to do Kanban. We'll put a bunch of work out here, and when team members get free, they'll pull it and work on it. And if they get sucked back into production, whatever, then they just leave it where it's at. And we'll have a big Kanban board. And when we finally get enough stuff across the board, then we'll decide to release or go live or show it to the customer. But I'm just going to give up on sprints. And this may sound crazy, but I see this a lot. I do see it takes time for management to mature and to support dedicated team members. And sometimes it can be so chaotic that starting out and in trying to improve your process, sprints don't make sense. All right. So this is like perfect world Agile we're looking at here. We put everybody together in the same room, and they talk like crazy, and everybody has the same knowledge level. And all my developers, they love feedback. They can't wait for another developer to give them feedback. So we do this pair programming where folks sit with each other and give each other feedback, and they kind of pass back and forth who the lead pilot is. And I can tell you this is beautiful. This is perfect. I train people to do this. I would guess 10% of the clients I've worked with actually do put everybody together like this. And I would say maybe 5% of the developers I encounter out there actually enjoy doing pair programming and sitting at one terminal with somebody. I think a lot of you know, a lot of developers, especially the older folks, consider themselves to be artists, and they really struggle with this model. And this is a good model from a productivity perspective. This is the way to go. But most places, you're not going to be set up like this, either due to management restrictions or to developers not supporting doing it. But most places I go, this is not happening. So if we get closer to the real world, most of the developers I work with, during sprint planning, they want to talk to everybody. They want to talk to business analysts. They want to talk to the customer. They want to talk to QA. They want to make sure everything's very crisp. But when it comes time to code, most developers I work with, if I go back a slide, they would be nauseous if I told them you're going to try to write code and people are going to walk up to you every 5 seconds and interrupt you and ask you a question or point out something in your code. Most developers hate this, and most developers are not effective in that kind of environment. So in the real world, I actually find it's a little like Violet in The Incredibles. A good project manager or scrum master will protect these people when we're in a crucial part of the sprint where they need to be very cerebral and focus on their code. I can even say myself, I've sent developers home for 2 or 3 days and told anybody who wanted to contact them they needed to go through me first to get that person's cell phone number. Because a lot of times if we don't do this, especially on complex code, things won't get delivered. So I see people take, in my opinion, in the real world, this collaborative thing too far in the middle of the development window. Not the early part of the requirements discussion, but once it's time to code, that's not a good time to have a lot of discussions. And if there's developers on the phone, hopefully you agree with me. And then issue number 6. Most people think we get these stories from the customer at the start of the sprint. We do sprint planning for a day or 2, like I was showing, and then boom, user experience, business analysts, developers, QA, we all viciously attack this work. And you can do that model if it doesn't really take a whole lot of time to mock up your screens, or if it doesn't take a lot of time to write test cases, or if your skill sets are pretty consistent across every team member. Everybody almost is like a jack of all trades. But most places I go, as we're in a sprint, especially when we're wrapping it up, it's more of a dev QA effort than it is like a business analysis or customer effort, or even user experience. At that point, if we've got questions about the requirements or the screen design late in the sprint, we probably did something wrong in sprint planning. So as one sprint's winding down, it's very common for user experience, business analysts, and the customers to start envisioning what stories they're going to take into sprint planning and start doing mock-ups or screen designs like this without developers or testers being in the room, just to kind of jumpstart the conversation when the next sprint starts. So I kind of see it like this. This is a client I'm currently working with, and in their model, they have what we call a week of pre-work, where business analysts really aren't needed in the current sprint, user experience isn't needed, the customer's not doing a whole lot of work, and they'll start grooming the backlog, as we call it, and putting artifacts together, and maybe doing mock-ups and wireframes, and then when they meet the team during this first few days of planning in week 1, they've got a lot of things to have a discussion around instead of the whole team trying to revolve around a very raw idea. So a lot of people say this isn't Agile, this is waterfall when you do pre-work, and it's not true. It really helps to kind of manage 2 masters. 1, trying to get value to the customer, but 2, trying to do it in an efficient way. You know, if we're a pure Agile team, maybe we say, well, the BAs and the product owner are just dedicated to the sprint, and even though I've got no work for them to do, they're not allowed to look at the next sprint yet. And in my experience, that's typically ignorant. The current sprint is that their wingman, if you will, but if they're free, they can start prepping for the next sprint, and it's highly encouraged. And as I mentioned here, if you've got business analysts, this is perfect. Business analysts love to do this pre-work and try to get things tidied up a little bit before they sit down with the team and discuss items in detail. And then lastly, maybe a bit of a complex discussion for today because I haven't met any folks on the phone and I don't know your background. But I'm going to assume that most of you are doing user stories or you're familiar with user stories. And a user story would look something like this. It'd have a title and it'd say, as a certain type of user, I want to do this task so that I can get this value. So in this example, as an account holder, I want to withdraw cash from the ATM. Why? So I don't have to go into the bank or when the bank's closed, like when I can't get money. Or I just don't want to go into the bank. I didn't shower today. Who knows? But there's a business reason. There's a story. I often see stories at this level taken into development and testing. And from my perspective, and I'll take a little more than my perspective, from my experience with numerous teams, this is so ambiguous. QA and development will start arguing, well, what should we do if the ATM can't give them a receipt because it's out of paper? What should we do if there wasn't enough money in their account? There will be all these questions about things that could go sideways, if you will, or exceptions or alternative ways to do the story. But I will see sprints start at this level. What I'd rather see is something closer to this, and if anybody on the phone is familiar with behavior-driven development, that's what I'm showing here. But what we want to do is if you have experience with use case before you ever learned Agile, we do want to take stories almost to the use case level and put them in a format like this. So scenario 1, perfect world, there's enough money in his account, there's enough money in the machine, there's paper, his card's good, and so this is what the system should do. And then scenario 2 under the story is this is what should happen when there's insufficient funds. Scenario 3, this is what we do when the card's been disabled, and so on and so on. We need to get to this level during sprint planning before we start coding, because if we don't, QA and dev and the product owner and the business analyst, everybody will fight about all these other alternatives or sideways kind of things, exceptions underneath the happy path. A lot of people just skip this, jump into the sprint, but I highly encourage getting to this level because this has huge impact on your estimates too. So those first couple of days, sprint planning, half a day, whatever you use, I really would want to see you get your stories to this level before you take off. And a lot of people have sprint failure because they don't do this. They actually kind of figure this out halfway through the sprint, and then they're rushing to try to code and test everything. All right, that's it. It's sort of a short presentation, and hopefully it'll lead to some good dialogue and some good questions.
All right, thanks, Greg. Britta, that concludes Greg's presentation. We're now moving on to the Q&A portion. We have time for about 30 minutes of Q&A. Using the chat window, you can send questions to me privately. We do not have any questions in the queue just yet, so we'll give people a minute or two to send some in. While we're waiting, just to touch on the last slide that you mentioned there, do you have any suggestions for specific techniques for moving from vague stories to better, more fleshed out stories?
Yeah, so this isn't really a detailed slide on how to learn this process, but anybody wants to email me afterwards, I'll send them 3 or 4 slides on the fundamentals of behavior-driven development. And a real cut to the chase is behavior-driven development is almost equivalent to use case. So anybody with use case experience on the phone, if you look at my scenario here, scenario 1, given is the same thing as precondition in the use case. So this scenario 1 has 3 preconditions. Account balance is greater than 100, the card's good, and the machine contains enough money. So those are 3 preconditions. When is the equivalent of the user's steps. So when the user does this, then is post-conditions. So post-condition on this one is money dispensed, account balance adjusted, card returned. So if you know use case, this is almost identical, but not to digress too much, you don't want to get to this level early when you're doing early planning and prioritization. You only want to do this when you're really close to a sprint and you know you're going to deliver it, because this is a lot of analysis work. So if folks want to ping me, I can point them to resources on behavior-driven development. As I noted here in the bottom, there's a guy named Dan North who I've learned a ton from in this area and helps me get to the point where teams don't go after ambiguous requirements.
Okay, all right, well, thank you. We do have a question in the queue now. Rob asks, you said that iteration is the same as sprint. His understanding of the definition is that the iteration is equivalent to a release and that a release can have 1 or more sprints. Can you help clarify that?
Oh, okay, so once again, be my experience, my knowledge. Iterations or sprints can tie to a release but don't have to. So in my experience, usually, especially at the start of a project, it takes 2 or 3 sprints to get to a level of functionality that would actually be usable by a target audience. So they can be tied together, but as a business rule, they are not one-to-one. A sprint or iteration, there are 1 too many sprints or iterations per release. So probably that's the best way to describe it. They can be one-to-one, but usually they're not.
Okay. Next question coming in from Kathy. When you have 1 or more developers who find that it's difficult to estimate the time required to complete work, how do you help them to give accurate estimates? Sometimes a developer just doesn't know what would be required.
Sure. So I was working with StubHub 2 years ago, and they acquired a company, I think, called Ticket Technology in Kansas City. And we went in and we trained that acquisition on Agile and told them they had to leave, I think they were doing .NET coding. They had to start using Java because StubHub did. And when it came time to estimate their work, the developers were like, I've never even coded in Java yet or done sprints. So their manager had, and getting started, their dev manager did the estimates for them. And then also started tracking their actuals and kind of held their hand. And as they did sprint planning, sprint after sprint, got them to a point where they had enough reference coding work on their own, and their manager had coached them to a point where they could start doing that on their own. But that is often an issue. People will say, well, my developers have never done that, but they have to do it because it's Agile. You really want a Scrum Master or a Dev Manager or somebody who has experience doing this estimation for sprints to hold their hand and coach them at the start till they feel comfortable doing it.
All right. So back in the slide where you're talking about distractions, you used a picture of pair programming as an example. Do you consider that to be a distraction, or was that just sort of trying to illustrate that this is a crazy environment?
If you have an environment where management supports setting up like this, and your developers like working like this is the way to go. This is the most productive way to do work. There's several studies on it. The most mature teams I have seen do this. And I think the point I wanted to make here is that's what the most mature teams do, and the most mature teams are maybe 10% of the corporations I encounter who can support this when Agile first rolls out. And this would be an aspire to state. But in reality, we're not close to there. And instead of pretending we are, if you are working in an environment where you're not doing pair programming, most developers who are working independently need isolation. I mean, I think we all know why they all have their headphones, right? Like don't bug me sometimes. I think we can all imagine that. If you work on something that's really big and complex and you get a train of thought going, every time you get interrupted, you've got to remember where you left off. So in the real world, I find you need to isolate these folks once coding starts, and really this kind of ties to their personality. If you've got developers who can be interrupted and you don't think it affects them, that's awesome. But if you've got a lot of folks who complain and say, this Agile stuff's killing me, I can't focus, like why is it even during coding I have to talk to people nonstop, then I do encourage this isolation. There is a critical moment in the sprint, and if you're not really mature enough or you don't have the kind of environment ready for pair programming, you are working independently, give these folks some isolation. I can even say myself as a Scrum Master or Project Manager, I've had some deadlines and stuff myself where I've hung a sign on the back of my chair that said, only disturb me if my chair's on fire. So I think we can all relate to that. Just as good coaches, know when to protect your people and let them get their work done.
Great. Okay, Ray asks, what is the difference between pre-work and planning?
Oh, that's good. So, is it up here? Yeah, so it is a little bit of planning. What typically happens is, in my example today, I've kind of talked about a sprint having the stories waiting for it at the start of every sprint. But most people do release planning and will lay out maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 sprints. They'll envision what's going to be in it. And they'll do what we call Agile release planning. So while while the team's wrapping up a sprint, there is a plan already out there that says, these are the stories we're going after next. And those stories usually look like this. They're at this level. And while the people are in that pre-work phase, a lot of times I'll actually ask the business analysts and the product owner to try to get it to this level before we show it to the team at the start of the next sprint. So you can call it planning if you want to. I would actually say it's going deeper on the requirements. It's refining them to as far as we can without talking to developers and testers, and getting more crisp. And some people use the term grooming. And I actually see it as a window often, too, for doing mock-ups and wireframes to make the stories more visual. Like I kind of showed here, like the city of New York, they'll do things like this. And because the business analysts are free at the end of a sprint, or the product owner is doing no work, and they'll say, if I bring this visual in with the story, sprint planning will go 3 times faster. So it is pre-planning, it's pre-design work, it's kind of going deeper on the requirements. So I'm not real hung up on what we call it. It is planning, but hopefully I did a good job of describing for you what I typically see happen in that window.
Okay, thank you. Just want to let everybody know to keep the questions coming here. We've got 1 or 2 more in the queue, and then hopefully some people will send some more in. So You had mentioned your top three, but I noticed the slides weren't actually in that order. Could you take us back and show us which ones you think are either the most prevalent or potentially the most damaging?
Yeah, so they're actually not ordered by sequence here, but I think the one that I mentioned that happens the most is probably this. And I don't know, you could even maybe take a vote, Justin. I don't know if you're set up with WebEx to do that, but I can't tell you that this has got to be number one. That people, either the customer or management or executives will say, I want something by a certain date, and the team will either not estimate it and say, okay, we'll try, or they will estimate it and they'll make their estimates fit. And a lot of times I'll see developers will say, hey, we know this doesn't fit, and their managers will say, well, they want it, we can't tell them. So this is probably number one. Yeah, and this is probably number one because you've already failed a sprint before it starts if you do this. When you get to the end, you basically committed to something you knew you couldn't do at the start. You're destined for failure unless you become a hero and somehow exceed your previous throughput. And you might do that by working weekends and other things, and then you're going to break the system. Like I was talking about earlier, there's usually numerous sprints, and if you burn out your team at the start, when you work lots of overtime, and I'm sure a lot of folks have seen these studies, productivity does go up for about 6 weeks, but then after about 8 weeks of overtime, throughput from a 40-hour team is better than a 60-hour team that's been working 60 hours forever. So this thing right here, this would probably be my number one, because this is sprint failure before it ever starts. There's no way you can win. Probably second that I see most prevalent, not in terms of impact, but happens the most frequently, is definitely the lost resources. Everybody is getting folks sucked away, even though they say, oh, we commit those people to the sprint. And it usually is because there's a hot production issue or so on. And then probably last for me, take a quick look to this. Let's see. I think sprint structure, like the lack of that, probably addresses 3 or 4 other items I don't even have on here today. So I would say the lack of sprint structure or envisioning what you're going to do during the sprint days would be in that top 3 also. And because it affects, if you don't do it, you'll waterfall. If you don't do it, the team won't be really clear on when they're supposed to be done with certain things. It's not good. And you don't have to be that, like I said, you don't have to do everything verbatim, but just to have a vision. Like we think we're going to have builds on this day and pass the QA on this day, and this is how we see the most high value things happening first. And this even makes sure that when you estimate, you take the critical path into account. Like if the first story isn't going to get passed to QA until week 2, then you can actually say, not how much capacity does QA have in the whole sprint, but how much do they have in the last 2 weeks, and will it fit that capacity? So there's a lot of beautiful things that come from putting the structure together. So that would probably be my top 3, and that's not universal by company. That is statistical probably across, like I said, I've worked with around 100 teams, 100 different projects. So this would probably be in that top 3.
Yeah. Those all sound really familiar to me. Definitely experienced all of those in the real world. Real similar to the number one also is when managers come to you or the customer comes to you and asks, I want this. How long is it going to take? Give me the 3 months, 6 months, 9 months sort of estimates. And we've had to, many times we've tried to have the conversation of, well, that's not really how it works, and we want to know what you want, but we're going to do things to build it as efficiently as possible, and we can't tell you how long it's going to take because we don't know all the details yet.
Right.
All right. So another question coming in from Anil. Where do junior developers fit into Agile development? What should management's approach be in bringing the developer up to speed?
I think the number one thing for management would be creating an environment where a junior developer can become a senior developer. So when I work with companies with high turnover, it's a real struggle to use Agile or to do sprints because we lose tribal knowledge so frequently. We lose the ability or the understanding of how we deliver stuff here at our company in this situation. So number one is to make it a job they love, to make it a company that they want to stay in. But then after that, and maybe someday, Justin, I can come back and we can just do a webinar on Agile for managers. But managers are supposed to be situational leaders. And I kind of alluded to this in one of our discussions just now. If you had somebody that was junior, you don't say, I'm going to watch that sprint fail because Agile says that they're a self-directed team. A manager would look at, like, just say 5 developers work for a manager, and the manager would say, okay, these 3 guys have been doing sprints forever. They know how to deliver. They know how to estimate their work. I'm not going to talk to them at all unless they ask me for help. This guy's somewhere in the middle, so I'm going to ask him if he needs help and kind of hold his hand in select areas, but he's almost been weaned. This person's brand new. They're clueless. I'm going to hold their hand and almost do some of the work for them every step through this first sprint. Then the next sprint, I'll start giving them more stuff to do on their own, and eventually, 3, 4, 5, 6 sprints, I will totally have taken them to that level where they can do all these practices on their own and be collaborative team members.
All right. So we've emptied the question queue for the moment here. Just sent a message out, but I'll repeat it here for everyone's benefit. We do still have about 15 minutes left, so we have time for a few more questions. If anyone has one. I had one saved up here, so I'll ask that. You mentioned the role of the business analyst. That's one of the, seems like has been the hardest role to define in some of my experiences there. But what are some of the ways that a business analyst can be integrated into a group to help prevent some of these pitfalls?
So I see business analysts, when you have them, they're usually the liaison from the customer to the team. So the customer's more at the strategic level, working more with like business stakeholders, maybe even has limited technical knowledge. So I see business analysts being the people who take this to almost like a functional description from the business side. So almost, if you guys know BRQs, taking business requirements down to an FRQ level, making the stories easier to understand with working with user experience or themselves designing screens. And then I also see, this is probably the biggest thing for business analysts, is when we come out of sprint planning, before the sprint construction and testing actually starts, they go to development and say, do you need anything else to understand what you need to code? Do you need another artifact? Do you need a flow chart? Do you need another screen design? Do you need a state diagram? Tell me what you need. If there's anything that's going to prevent you from being able to do it, I want to know that. QA, same thing. What stops you from being able to test this? Do you need something else from me? Are my acceptance scenarios not clear to you? Customer. So the business analyst will go back to the customer. Here's the artifacts I've given the team. Here's when we plan on demonstrating this stuff to you. Is there anything you need from me on this sprint, customer? So I see a business analyst being sort of a documentation and sort of a requirements person, making sure everybody has what they need to do their job in a sprint.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got another question here. Prior to a series of iterations, one needs to have an end game plan. That plan may help determine if the project is multi-year, 1 year, 6 months. Several sprints may be needed to get ready for coding. How do you estimate a chunk of work when the final project end game could cause or would cause rework of initial sprint work?
Let's see. So maybe another time, too, we can come back and do an overall Agile life cycle. I totally agree with whoever asked that question. We typically take a project through envisioning. We talk about what the biggest constraints are in the project. We get an initial high-level product backlog of requirements. We prioritize those. And then we do high-level estimation, doing T-shirt sizing or story points or whatever you want to call it, comparing to work we've done in the past. Without breaking this work down, we'll go look for similar work we've done to come up with a long-range estimate. So that's how we would do it and lay out the sprints. But the question about can we do that to a point where sprint rework is never needed? If we could actually lay out a project plan like, I'm looking to see real quick here in another slide if I have a recent example. I don't think, no, I don't have a good example here, but at least one I couldn't bring up that doesn't involve privacy issues. But if you lay out 10 sprints and say your sprints go for a month each and you tell the customer it looks like 10 months from now we'll be ready to go live, the odds of that happening, are probably plus or minus, I don't know, two or three sprints on each end depending on what your history of work looks like. So we don't do long-term planning to say this is guaranteed. We do it so the customer can make some strategic decisions. But we don't typically commit to that. And if we actually knew for sure that there wasn't going to be any need to replan in between sprints, we wouldn't be doing sprints. We wouldn't need Agile. So if somebody thinks that by doing long-term planning and laying out 10 sprints, there won't be discoveries, that kind of defeats the purpose. If we actually know that crisply and can guarantee nothing's going to change on a project, you might be wanting to go lean closer to a waterfall approach if you really don't think there's going to be any discovered missing requirements or any technical issues throughout the project. Okay. And in my experience, I don't see that much. Even there's a few cookie cutter projects that we do where it's a commodity type thing that everybody's done before. But most software projects I see, there are nonstop discoveries, no matter how much we plan.
Absolutely. I think even the word iteration kind of implies that you're going to be continually going back and reworking and improving on what you have. So another question here. When you talked about hitting the panic button and going to Kanban when a sprint, you just can't have enough focus or resources for a sprint. How do you come back from that? How does that not become just a failure of the process and falling back to a different method and abandoning the sprint process? How do you start things back up or get momentum back after that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, whoever said that. I'm going to look at it slightly different. I'm not going to say it's a failure. I'm going to say you bit off more than you can chew. So I make my money by going in and looking at a company, and they tell me the business reason they're wanting to move to Agile. I'll go in and assess what they're currently doing and say, here's a level of Agile I think you can progress to without totally having to shut down for 6 months and wrecking productivity. So we're going to try a few things like a backlog or stories or something. Some of those things that let you can start walking into it and changing the culture in parallel. Some people will go for sprints right away, and they are not ready for it. So I would say in that instance, if you had to abort, it was a case where you really didn't sit down and think about how mature you were or what you could truly support from an Agile perspective. And even then, Kanban isn't a total failure. It still makes your work visible and supports a lot of the Agile principles. And then it might give you time to do the training and start working on the cultural change with management to support sprints. So it may be a failure from some folks' perspective, but a lot of times it's a case where we tried something that we weren't ready for. Most teams, most companies can handle sprints from the start. I'd say 80% of the ones I work with. But I have seen probably about 20% where management just keeps pulling folks away, even though when they train with me, when I meet with them one-on-one and show them the repercussions of stealing people, and I even show them how it hurts the overall company throughput, it's a hard cultural change, as I'm sure folks know. It's education and culture and their experiences, and sometimes it's hard to move. So I wouldn't call it a failure. I would actually say it's a mitigation technique. So we still have a way to deliver stuff in this chaos, and we haven't given up.
All right. That's a great way to look at it. Another question coming in from Kathy. If a story requires development work that is new to the developers available, how do you incorporate the need for developers to do research in order to learn how to accomplish the tasks in a particular sprint?
Sure. So, and this is just one example. And this is one company I'm working with. And when they're in a sprint, let's just say this represents they're in sprint 1. If you look at the second week on day 5, it says grooming meeting for next sprint. We typically will pull a developer or two, the lead developer, whatever, for about an hour to sit down with the business analyst, the product owner, user experience, and they say, we think these are the stories we're going to be asking the team for when you guys come out of this sprint in 7 days. And these are the artifacts we have and so on. And they'll ask them, how do you feel? Like, what are you going to need from us to actually be able to plan this the first 2 days of the next sprint? And it's common in this that a development team might say, no matter what you bring, I think I've got like a sprint's worth of investigation or research to do. So at that point, we might even split a story and say, okay, for the next sprint, we're only going to do research on it. So that's what we do. We try to expose what's coming down the line, not only in this grooming meeting, but there's usually a release plan too that shows 3 or 4 sprints down the road. And we try to ask developers and architects if they think they're going to need some more time to do research and so on. And if they do, we try to allocate it in the sprint. So maybe there can actually be research work done on a story on one sprint, and then maybe we actually go after it in another sprint.
All right. So before we wrap up here, can I get you to go back and refresh everybody on your IPMA appearance?
hopefully that's visible. If it's not, you can go to just type in IPMAWA and lay it right on the forum. So, and it looks great. I'm actually only there on the 21st to present, but I'm going to try to get there both days because the presentations look awesome. Some great discussions.
Yep, I'm definitely looking forward to it. This is our big event for State IT, our annual event, and so it's quite the production. Don't want to give away too much, but I just thought I would tease everybody. There is going to be a major announcement related to Agile development and the state's sort of resources that will be available to you for that. So stay tuned. Come to IPMA and find out more. And then afterwards, we will let everybody know as part of this Agile Fridays as well what's going on with that. So just a little teaser there to get everybody's palates wet. We do not have any questions in the queue right now. We have just 5 minutes left. So if anyone wants to try and sneak one in, this is your chance. Otherwise, we can wrap it up and let everybody get out to lunch. It's not exactly a beautiful sunny day here in Olympia, but we're used to it.
Yeah, I'm used to it. And my contact information is here also. Folks want to ping me afterwards with questions, no problems, especially the folks who were interested in behavior-driven development. I can send them a few slides and point them to some online resources.
Yep, yeah, I had a couple specific requests for that, and I will pass those on to you privately after the presentation.
Excellent.
All right, give people just a couple more minutes here, see if anybody wants to get a question in. So will this be your first time at IPMA then, Greg?
It is. It is. I've actually I presented at Olympia PMI. I think I was a keynote like 2 or 3 months ago, and met Jack Tolfson. And Jack told me all about IPMA, and been learning more and more. And like I kind of kicked off and said, I'm kind of burned out on going to Houston to see Exxon or New Jersey to see somebody like TD Ameritrade, or I want to do more work at home. So I would love to be doing work down in Olympia, and that's why I went down to the PMI chapter and why I'll be at IPMA.
Great. All right.
A drive to Olympia is much easier than a flight to the East Coast.
Oh, I bet. All right. Well, I think we will wrap it up now. So I thank you, everyone, for the great questions. Next week, we're going to have Jean Marie Asola, Glenn Trentham, and Alan Chetaluwada from the University of Washington, and they will be joining us to share their Agile Transition case study. You can always find out about what's coming up and view previously recorded webinars at ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays. We will also have a copy of the slide deck there. Big thanks to Greg, GS Solutions, and Results Washington for helping to make Agile Fridays a success. And thank you, everyone that joined us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.